I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we continue to analyse Vladimir Putin's state visit to North Korea, and we talk to security analyst Jimmy Rushton in Kyiv on the situation on the front line and Ukrainian strategy for the year ahead.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 19th of June, 2 years and 118 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and our guest, the security analyst Jimmy Rushton. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, thanks, David. Hi, Jimmy. Great to have you back. So last night, Ukraine's air defence said it shot down 19 of 21 Shahed-type drones across the country. This comes from the Air Force. Ukrainian authorities said they intercepted the drones over Kherson, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Kirovrad, Khmelnytsky and Lviv Oblast. That's generally in the south and the west of the country. No big numbers in terms of casualties, some numbers in Lviv, a couple of people injured by falling debris, but no wider casualties as yet that I could find. Next, very grim story. The beheaded body of a Ukrainian soldier was discovered by an aerial reconnaissance team on top of a damaged military vehicle yesterday. Ukraine's prosecutor general said that he had, in his words, horrifying evidence of a new Russian policy of beheading captive soldiers instead of detaining them. I'll talk about that in a moment. But writing on Twitter, Henri Kostin said, "We have received information that Russian commanders have ordered not to take Ukrainian servicemen prisoner, but instead to kill them with inhuman cruelty by beheading. This is yet another proof that the war crimes committed by the aggressor are not isolated incidents, but a planned strategy of the Russian regime. This is terrible barbarism that has no place in the 21st century, and these criminal orders were given at the level of the battalion and company leadership." End of quote. Now, you will see images on social media. If you look hard enough, you'll see all the images I've seen have what we think is the head pixelated out, so it's not behind any graphic content warning, so just be aware. If you see images of that, you'll see a very large vehicle first of all, and then you'll realise what you're looking at. So there is no warning on it if you come across it by accident, but that's out there on social media. Now, questions I have on this, and from the statement there by Ukraine's prosecutor general, how does he know that such orders were given to battalion and company leadership? That is very tactical, down to battalion and company leadership. So how do they know? Extremely unlikely that we will ever be told what the source was. But if they're saying it's at that level, that would suggest some kind of radio or electronic warfare intercept. Now, second question for me, is this individual cruelty, which I accept runs in great swathes through the Russian armed forces, or, as is stated, a new policy, an actual policy of beheading captives instead of detaining them? That is a very obvious war crime. Mr. Kostin says it's a new policy. Now, I'm in no way trying to excuse or downplay any such alleged behaviour or in any way soften the image of the Russian army. We've seen how it has acted and behaved. But these are very strong allegations and therefore need to be treated as such when we are discussing them, and that requires strong journalistic scrutiny. So I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm not saying I think Mr. Kostin is making it up or pushing up propaganda. I'm just saying there's a lot in there talking about a new policy and talking about the level at which this proof is supposed to have come from, battalion and company leadership. So there's a lot of stuff in there that I don't think we will ever get an answer to because it would reveal too many sources. But I'm just noting it as part of the discussion because I think this will form part of the background as we move forward with this war. We've just got to be very careful about what we are talking about here. Okay. Now, wider, military but slightly away from the battlefield, Denmark has announced another package of military aid for Ukraine, the 19th such package from Denmark. This is going to include cash to go into the defence industry, the defence industrial base in Ukraine, equipment for F-16 jets and more straight donated Danish military equipment. Now, it's not entirely new money. This latest announcement allows the use of already committed 1.2 billion Danish kroner. That's about 170 million US dollars. And that was allocated under the two most recent packages. So not quite smoke and mirrors, but it's not new money in and of itself. First donations from this package expected to begin this summer. And just as a reminder, Denmark, along with the Netherlands, Belgium and Norway, have promised F-16s for Ukraine. And Denmark has already allocated nearly 65 billion Danish kroner, about 9 billion US dollars, in military aid under its fund for the period 23 to 28. So a 5-year period, which gives Ukraine time to plan what to do with the money. So you can actually then speak to your defence industrial base and build for the future. That reporting comes from the Kyiv Independent, I should say. Next one, Italy may well be joining the Storm Shadow alliance. The country is said to be preparing to include a batch of British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles in the next round of military aid it supplies to Ukraine. This is coming out of Italian media. Italian Defence Minister Guido Crosetto will present the plan to Italy's parliament by the end of the month. Okay, here we go. Il Fatto Quotidiano reported. Apologies. Now, the move is going to make Italy the fourth NATO ally to supply long-range missiles to Ukraine after US, UK and France. UK and France supplying the Storm Shadow, variants thereof. What's the name of the French Storm Shadow? Blimey. Name escapes me. Anyway, that one. Same thing, different name, same missile. Now, next one, a really interesting story, again from the Kyiv Independent. Swiss media outlet Blick is reporting today, citing undisclosed sources, that missiles for the Patriot air defence system manufactured for Switzerland by the US are to be delivered instead to Ukraine, despite contractual obligations. According to Blick, Bern has an order totaling 340 million US dollars. Scalp, thank you, Gerhard. Yes, the Scalp missile, the Italian missile is Scalp, the equivalent of the British Storm Shadow. Apologies, but thank you, Gerhard. Just messaged me there. So Bern has an order already for a total of about 340 million US dollars for the pact 3 variant of the missile. Each missile said to cost about 4 million US dollars. But sources are said to have told Blick that the US has decided to delay delivery to Switzerland, send them instead to Ukraine. Now, this is interesting because we often hear that it is the end-user agreement and contractual obligations that stops countries such as Switzerland donating military kit and stops Germany being able to, or stops Spain being able to donate Leopard tanks to Ukraine because Germany has a say-so, for example, and there are other examples. So anything that sort of pushes back against the contractual obligations I find interesting. And a reminder here on Patriot, the German-led initiative to get more Patriot missiles to Ukraine, which started in April, currently has, we are told, 68 missiles in the process of going to Ukraine. This was from German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius speaking on June the 11th. So, that's certainly one to watch, and I'll be very interested to see if there was any pushback from Switzerland about that, or any wider conversation about quite what this means for contracted or contractual obligations and those military contracts that are already signed and in place, whether or not they can be broken and what the penalty may or may not be for that. But I'll take a little pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Francis Dearnley, can I come to you? Our Telegraph live blog on the war has been bringing us updates almost every 20 minutes, every half an hour, of the state visit of Vladimir Putin to North Korea. You've been looking at the same story. What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks, David. North Korea doesn't get many state visits. It's an international pariah, a pastiche of Soviet communism treated almost as a historical curiosity, a subject of macabre fascination, despite the abject barbarism at its heart. Death camps, summary executions, brainwashing, a people forced to live inside a deadly time capsule, which only survived and survives at the behest of its Chinese backers, who won't let it fall for fear of Western-style expansion closer to its borders. It is an enduring sin of spheres of influence philosophy. Typically, no world leader would want to be seen anywhere near it, certainly not to celebrate it in any way, but only to try and pacify it, perhaps. Not so with Vladimir Putin. who seems to have no qualms about the carefully choreographed parades, delirious crowds, garish colours, roses and red carpets, like a Disneyland totalitarianism. A guard of honour met him at the tarmac, where Kim Jong-un smiled and embraced him in the early hours of this morning, where a drive through the streets, waving at the crowds, followed, watched on by huge posters of the two leaders adorning the surrounding buildings. All this conceals the desperate food and energy shortages which suffocate North Korea's economy and people. But evidently, the North Korean regime thinks the cost is worth it. And it might well be. Putin has just signed a new defence pact with North Korea that includes a vow of mutual aid if either is attacked. Describing the agreement with Kim Jong-un as a comprehensive partnership treaty, Putin said that the document provides for mutual assistance in case of aggression against one of the parties. It's not clear what kind of assistance the deal involves. It's deliberately vague. It follows Putin thanking Kim for his support, though, in Ukraine, and said the countries would fight against the imperialist, hegemonistic policies of the US and its satellites. Kim Jong-un said the agreement was of a peaceful and defensive nature, but added that it will become a driving force, accelerating the creation of a new multipolar world. That phrase, again, we hear again and again. Now, as discussed yesterday, the fear is that Russia is sharing its own nuclear intelligence and weapons tech with the North Koreans. But I wonder whether the biggest reward for North Korea, apart from the payments, of course, it's receiving from its weapons stock, is to give it a mouthpiece internationally under the cover of Russia. Gives it a lot of attention and indeed clout amongst certain countries. Putin, for instance, has just called for a review of Western sanctions against North Korea. I doubt that will do much good given his relationship at present with the West, but it gets their message out there, which is more than North Korea gets a lot of the time. Now, Putin, as I said yesterday, now goes to Vietnam, which has upset the US mightily. For more on that, do listen to yesterday's podcast. And speaking of Vietnam, there's an interesting piece in The Guardian too, which we'll add a link to in the show notes, about Ukraine's Vietnamese community, a sizable but often hidden minority in the country. Some Vietnamese people left Ukraine after the Russian invasion, but others have stayed, particularly those of the younger generation, many of whom were born in Ukraine and are Ukrainian citizens. The piece interviews soldiers and business owners of Vietnamese descent and offers quite an interesting perspective. But what is the significance, David, of this visit to North Korea in the round? I think it's essentially iron-bottoming the support that Kim Jong-un has given to Putin in terms of those all-vital weapons supplies, whilst Russia gets its own economy going in the way that we've described again and again in terms of its shifting to a war economy even more strongly. It's also the building of those alliances that are all important for Russia at the moment in terms of Iran, North Korea, and of course China. There is what some are describing a new axis of evil forming, but at the very least, even if it wasn't that severe, it does speak to multiple countries getting together who mutually benefit from this relationship. Though I would say, again, that rather than us interpreting it necessarily as a sign of Western weakness, as these countries are forming a new bloc, rather we should perhaps see it more in terms of Putin has no choice but to be going to a country that otherwise he wouldn't have been seen near. A former G8 leader, after all, now forced to go and receive the, as I say, Disneyland totalitarianism from a country which really is a pariah state. I don't think he would have wanted to be seen near it, frankly, and it speaks a lot that he hasn't been there for over 24 years. Now, as I say, crimes against humanity are the lifeblood of the North Korean regime. It's the only way it survived for so many decades, after all. And given the behaviour of Russian forces in Ukraine, which Dom referenced earlier on, is it any wonder, really, that they are becoming ever closer allies? And on that subject, I do just want to point listeners to a difficult article, but an important one, published in our paper called The Haunting Pictures of Emaciated Ukrainian Prisoners of War by Harriet Barber, who's also been on the podcast previously. It shows a series of photographs documenting the hardships Ukrainian POWs have endured at the hands of their Russian captors. In some, Their smiling faces are almost unrecognisable. Such is the degree of weight loss they have suffered. Others show bruises and wounds, injuries they have sustained when they are tortured in captivity. And for those listeners who didn't manage to listen to our episode with Sean Pinner, a British soldier who was captured by the Russians, I highly recommend it if you want to hear about the horrific conditions he was kept in and also the torture that he endured. An episode from a few weeks ago. You'll be able to find it if you search his name and the name of the podcast on Google. Now, suffice to say, under the Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war must be treated humanely and with dignity and must be provided with daily food rations. Rations shall be sufficient in quantity, quality and variety to keep prisoners of war in good health and to prevent loss of weight or the development of nutritional deficiencies. That is what the convention reads. There is no evidence of that here whatsoever. And just as an aside, and on this theme, I've just finished reading a book called Colditz, the German story, by Reinhold Eggers, one of the German staff who was security officer of the prisoners of war of that camp during the Second World War. It's a fascinating read for lots of reasons, but one thing that comes across strongly in the case of Colditz specifically was the onus given to the Geneva Convention, which allowed soldiers to receive decent packages of food, not only from the German state, but also from the Red Cross, even when the German guards themselves faced serious privations in rations later on in the war. There are also complaints able to be lodged by prisoners to higher authorities in Germany and elsewhere, with them sometimes getting the better of the rules being put in place by the guards once it was put forward to these tribunals. Now, I don't mention this here to try and argue that the Russians today are worse than the Nazis. There was no such care, of course, given to the Russian or Soviet prisoners of war or Jewish people by the Nazi state, for instance, only as evidence of how seriously those conventions have historically been taken, even in the most barbaric of conflicts and circumstances. And as we've said before, we should be aspiring to a better world in which the terms of the rules of law that existed during the Second World War, not arguably worse, that we are seeing today. And it says something that so many people are turning a blind eye to the suffering of those Ukrainian soldiers detailed in that piece. So I do recommend that people do not avert their eyes. The link will be in the show notes.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, Nicholls and Francis Dearnley. It's a great pleasure to welcome back our guest, security analyst Jimmy Rushton. Jimmy, would you just start by briefly reintroducing yourself to our audience? Jimmy Rushton.
Yeah, hello. I'm Jimmy Rushton. I'm a security and foreign policy analyst and also a freelance journalist, and I've lived in Kyiv for 2 years now. And I'm going to just apologise in advance if there's any background noise, because I've had to relocate from my flat because we had a power cut. One of the joys of living in Kyiv at the moment is scheduled and unscheduled power cuts. We have on average 12 to 14 hours of power a day. They're rolling blackouts for the rest of the time across the city. Kyiv is slightly less affected than other regions, but yeah, it can still be trying when you're trying to record a podcast, for example.
Well, we can hear you loud and clear, luckily. We'll come on to managing those scheduled and unscheduled blackouts later. But could you start just by telling us, I mean, we were chatting before you've come on, and you were very recently in Kharkov and Liman. Can you tell us why you went there and what you found?
Yes, so I went there to spend some time with the 241st Territorial Defence Brigade and also the 79th Air Assault Brigade, partly for my own research, partly because I'd known some of the guys from the 241st and we wanted to... I connected them with some volunteers that I knew because the 241st Air Territorial Defence Battalion, they're from Kyiv, so I'd just by chance met some of their guys in Kyiv as part of my work, and they'd recently suffered an artillery hit. They'd had all of their electronic warfare kit burnt down, so I connected them with some other friends of mine, and we delivered them some FPV jammers, drone jammers, some other equipment, a Mavic drone, a generator, that sort of thing. And then we stayed overnight there, had a chance to have a chat with some of the sappers from the 79th Air Assault Brigade, and they were telling me obviously about their experiences fighting and how they're trying to hold back the Russians. And it is one of the most difficult sectors of the front line for the Ukrainians at the moment. The day after, we travelled to Liman and spent some time with the Presidential Brigade of the National Guard. They're actually one of the few brigades that's actually advancing at the moment. So they're in Luhansk, in Crimean Forest, and alongside the Azov Brigade, they've taken about 1 kilometre of the front across a 2 kilometre radius away from the Russians. So they're doing some impressive work there. Also spent some time in Kyiv recently with Kraken. That was just after the latest Russian incursion into Kyiv Oblast kicked off. Just wanted to get their perspective on both the incursion and also the defense of the city, because the Western prohibition on using Western-provided weapons to hit targets on the Russian side of the border really had a massive impact on how they were able to defend both Kyiv city and Kyiv Oblast in the border sense, because the city was getting absolutely pounded by S-300 Zephyr missiles being used in a ground attack role. And the Ukrainians knew exactly where they were. They had the weaponry that could reach out and hit them in the M4 and 142 HIMARS firing GMLRS rockets, but they weren't able to do it because all of the restrictions that were put on them. So essentially the city was getting pounded by these S-300 missiles needlessly. And yeah, once that restriction was lifted, the situation both for the defenders fighting against the Russian incursion and for the residents of Kharkiv changed almost overnight. And it's been far more peaceful in Kharkiv, and the defense in Vovchansk has been far more effective. It's still very difficult for them, but now they can hit targets inside Russia proper. It's been far easier for them because before they were fighting with one hand, metaphorically tied behind their back.
Well, Jimmy, there's lots and lots of questions. Let's start then with your recent sort of, you talked us through your visits around the sort of frontline cities. What kind of things were the soldiers telling you about the fighting on the front lines? What do you think listeners around the world should know about the conditions under which they fight, the tempo of operations, and who do you think has got the strategic advantage at this moment?
I think it very much depends on what section of the front you're talking about. So around Krakow, it's very difficult. I would say the Russians they're pushing very hard and they have the upper hand. Go to, say, Crimean Forest. The Ukrainians are advancing in a limited fashion there. Around Kharkiv, it's a stalemate with probably a Ukrainian advantage, and the Russians are taking huge casualties to capture what is relatively insignificant amount of territory from Ukraine. Obviously, they've caused a huge amount of damage and they've essentially leveled Vovchansk, but for the amount of casualties they've taken, they really haven't gotten that much from it. In regards to what the soldiers are telling me, they're tired. They're very tired. Most of them have been fighting for 2 years now. They are appreciative of Western aid, but there is a frustration that it takes too long to arrive, and there have been conditions attached, particularly when I was speaking to my contact in Kraken. I asked him what would have been the case if the restrictions had been lifted before the Russians had reinvaded Kharkiv Oblast. Would they have been able to pull it off? And he said, no, absolutely not, because we knew exactly where they were massing. We could see their troop concentrations, but we really couldn't hit them with anything effective enough to do significant damage, because the Ukrainians have older ex-Soviet artillery of their own, but it's old. It's not particularly accurate. It's nowhere near as effective as, say, HIMARS or GMLRS. So, yeah, that's really what they've been telling me. The other thing I would say is it's really a drone war. Every unit that I speak to tells me how important drones are to them, both FPV-type drones, Mavic types. If they don't have drones, they simply cannot fight. And the Russians also, it's the same for them. They rely on drones to a huge degree for strike in regards to FPV drones, and also for observation in regards to Mavic drones. And yeah, that's both the case for the Ukrainians and the Russians.
Jimmy, we've heard of this advance in Donetsk towards this road, this key Ukrainian supply line. Can you give us your thoughts on what's happening there, and how dangerous is it for Ukraine right now? What might happen next?
So the most critical point in Donetsk is Chasiv Yar by a great margin. And currently the 93rd Mechanized Brigade are in Chasiv Yar. And I was actually with them, not in Chasiv Yar, but just behind Chasiv Yar a few weeks ago. And they basically said to me that this is the most important point, and if Chasiv Yar falls, then the rest of Donetsk will fall as well. If the Russians take Chasiv Yar, they'll be on high grounds. They'll be able to threaten the Ukrainian logistics hub of Konstantinivka. They've already pushed very close to the key road connecting Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka. It's now in FPV range. They're about 8 kilometers away. So that road is very dangerous now. Ukrainians still use it, but it's difficult. And yeah, if they can take Chasiv Yar, then it's going to be incredibly difficult for them. And the 93rd, to be fair, they're holding incredibly strongly in Chasiv Yar, and the Russians really haven't been able to make that much progress there. They're one of Ukraine's best brigades. They've got very good equipment. They're very highly motivated, and their troops are well trained, and they know exactly what's at stake as well. So, yeah.
Looking ahead to the summer then, what are the concerns and the thinking of soldiers and strategists on the Ukrainian side? What will they be looking to improve or correct heading through the summer months and into the autumn?
That's a very good question. I think obviously one of the big concerns for Ukrainian units is there hasn't been that much rotation. So, like I said before, they've been fighting pretty much continuously for 2 years now. And they are getting, even the best units like the 93rd, they're getting worn down, they're getting tired. And to be honest, no matter how good a soldier you are, there's a limit of how much combat and combat stress you can endure before you essentially become ineffective. So I think the mobilization obviously has started, the new wave of mobilization has started in Ukraine, ensuring that Ukraine's best brigades can get some rest and can reconstitute themselves and retrain and regroup. And then potentially there were some rumblings about a new Ukrainian offensive in 2025. I don't actually believe that. I think probably Ukraine is going to stay on the defensive for the foreseeable future. Probably almost certainly because its defense has a primacy in this war now. We saw the Russians in Vovchansk. They did advance a small amount of miles into Ukrainian territory, but then they bogged down and they took incredibly heavy casualties. And yeah, defense is incredibly powerful at the moment, especially with the kind of technologies that we're seeing emerging, FPV drones and the like. So yeah, I think rebuilding a reserve for Ukraine, enabling rotation, and really staying on the defensive and exacting as heavy a cost from the Russians as possible will be the key goal moving into summer and moving into the winter.
Jimmy, hi, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us again. Great to hear from you. I'm going to move, I've got 4 questions if I may. I'm going to move north to south, and then I have a general question for you, please. So number one, up in north of Kharkiv, the Vovchansk area, we've been discussing this quite a lot on the pod. What do you think was happening up there? Was that an attempt by Russia to open up a new front, or was it some form of diversion for a push in the Donbass or through Sumy or something like this that just got bogged down, that didn't actually achieve anything?
I think it was a bit of both or a bit of all of those. I do think that one of the main goals was to bring Kharkiv into artillery range, which has thankfully failed because they've been using S-300 missiles and a range of other munitions to attack Kharkiv. But once you put a city like that within artillery range, it becomes a lot cheaper and a lot easier to inflict severe damage to it. And thankfully they failed in that regard. I also think that there was an element of they wanted to pull reserves away from Donetsk and the Donbass. I do think that has been successful in many regards. I mean, for example, Kraken were fighting in Chasiv Yar. Then when Vovchansk, when the incursion into Kharkiv happened, they relocated because Kraken are originally from the Kharkiv region, and they were amongst another couple of Ukraine's best military units like the 92nd Assault Brigade and one of the airborne brigades, which was it, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. And they were elite units, some of Ukraine's best equipped and best trained and best motivated units that were pulled in to blunt the Russian assault. So I think it was an element of all, really. But thankfully, it hasn't been as successful. It definitely hasn't been successful in putting Kharkiv into artillery range, which would have been an absolute disaster.
Yeah, I think you're on the money there. I think the fact that it was expected to do so many things meant that it didn't do any of them particularly well. In the British military, there's 10 principles of war in no particular order, except the first one, which is selection and maintenance of the aim. So you got to decide what you want to do, and that overrides everything else. And it sounds like they just tried to do too much with it, which is possibly why it came unstuck. Next one then. So moving south down the front line, a bit of a general geographical question. What's the latest that you've seen on the building of fortifications from Ukraine? We've heard a lot of noise, a lot of activity. We've seen some photos looking a bit shonky, not brilliantly well prepared defensive positions, although they might look good for a brochure type thing. But what's your view on how the Ukrainian fortification and defensive line is progressing?
Well, so there are actually significant and very well constructed defences going up pretty much everywhere, and that includes in areas around Kyiv, Kharkiv, and down across the front line. So there are some very significant defences going up. I don't really want to go into too much detail, but they're well constructed, they're well thought out. You can see that they've considered fields of fire, and they're mutually supportive in most cases, which is obviously what you want with static defences. And they're also building multiple lines, so it's not just that they build one line, they also build secondary and tertiary lines as well. So I think they've learnt the lesson. The big question is, why didn't they do this before? Like one of the biggest questions that pretty much everyone that I've spoken to asks is why weren't there any defensive lines or serious defense lines behind Avdiivka? They controlled that city since 2014, and there was no serious effort to build an effective defensive line behind it. They're remedying the issue of defensive lines now, but that was one of the biggest criticisms before, that they hadn't built these lines. But they're going up now, and they seem to be relatively effective from what I can see.
That's really interesting. It chimes with what we saw when we visited in February. I know Francis pushed Podolyak and Danilov very hard on this and was told, no, it's all fine, it's all going well. And we think that was, well, let's be generous, that was optimistic, if not a little bit fudgy. I think Colonel Roman Kostenko I spoke to, he was a bit more honest perhaps, but he did say, yeah, it's a problem, we've got to get on with it, we should have done it before. So interesting to see that now seems to have turned a corner. Thank you. Right, a couple more. Now this might be a very quick one. Down south, what is happening, if any idea, what's the latest on what's happening on the left bank in the area of Kherson? That sort of push, that whatever it was, the raid, that incursion by Ukraine across the river, held a bit of ground, never really exploited it, but also didn't get shoved back into the river, as far as we can tell. Are you hearing anything from down south at the moment?
So it's really not an area that have that much information about, because I haven't spoken to that many units involved in that operation. I will say that, speaking to an American volunteer that was deployed in Krinky 3 or 4 weeks ago, he said that it's really an operation to tie the Russians down, to force them to deploy troops in Kherson, to make them think that if they don't deploy troops there, then the Ukrainians could just push out. And also the logistics for the Russians on the left bank of the Dnipro are quite difficult. It's quite difficult terrain on that side of the river. So yeah, I can't really go into that much detail because I simply don't know. But I know that the goal of it was essentially partly diversionary, and partly because for the Ukrainians, having a foothold on the left bank is obviously strategically important for a future potential counter-offensive into the Russian-controlled territory on the left bank.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Thank you. And then finally for me, I know Francis has got a few. Finally for me, what's the general mood in any conversations you're having about mobilisation and this lowering of the age and the expectation that it may come down from 25 in the future as well? What's the mood amongst the soldiers, amongst those that have been called up, and amongst the general public that you chat to?
It varies, to be honest. There is definitely a mood of some people are scared of mobilisation, which, to be honest, is a completely natural reaction to having to contemplate going to war, because the majority, actually almost 100% of the military at this point, are people that never considered being soldiers until Russia invaded their country. So it's difficult. That being said, there is, for example, take some of the brigades that I mentioned before, so 93rd Mechanised Brigade, Azov, 3rd Assault Brigade. These brigades actually have waiting lists to join. So it's not that Ukrainians don't want to join the military, but they want to join brigades that are well-trained, well-equipped, and well-led. And I think, to be honest, this is a failing of the government here, that they haven't really copied what some of these brigades have done exceptionally well. For example, 3rd Assault Brigade is modelled very much on a NATO standard brigade, and it has after-action reports, it has mission tactics, which is a NATO way of planning missions and command and control. And some brigades just don't have that. It's a very kind of Soviet mentality, and the word Soviet in Ukraine is absolutely a pejorative. Like, if a Ukrainian describes something as Soviet, they're not complimenting it at all, obviously. So it is difficult for a lot of Ukrainians. A lot of Ukrainian men are scared. Unfortunately, that's what happens in a country that is fighting for its life in an existential war of survival against an enemy that is literally has genocidal intent against the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. Because if Ukraine loses this war, Ukraine ceases to exist, almost certainly. So it's difficult. And honestly, being a foreign here and observing it can be uncomfortable at times, because it's obviously you're very conscious that you're not at risk of being mobilized. You're not at risk of being called up, even though you do take a certain element of risk as a reporter here. But yeah, it's not easy, and it's not easy for, obviously, mainly not easy for the Ukrainians. It's a difficult situation for sure.
Jimmy, it's Francis. Thanks so much for your time and for coming on the podcast again. Always great to hear from you. Hi, Jimmy. My first question is, we were just talking about mobilisation there. And of course, Syrskyi, when he took over as Commander-in-Chief, he talked about back in March saying that we being Ukraine, we didn't necessarily require to have the 500,000 mobilised that he was originally talking about. My question is broader than that, though, which is there were lots of questions about Syrskyi's reputation amongst the armed forces when he took over from General Zaluzhny. I wonder what you're hearing with regards to attitudes about him. Has he surprised people? Do we have a sense yet about what he has injected in terms of strategy into the front lines that compares to Zaluzhny? Very interested in general reflections you've heard on Syrskyi now that he's been in post for some time.
Yeah, I think it's mixed. Some Ukrainian soldiers rate him higher than Zaluzhny, some don't. It's very common amongst soldiers in any military to complain about the higher-ups. It's just something that soldiers do. I do think there was a lot of criticism about Avdiivka, and that is on both Zaluzhny and Syrskyi. I think one common criticism I've heard about Syrskyi is that he has a tendency to micromanage. Right, so he'll go to the front and he'll order around individual units, which is not always particularly helpful as Commander-in-Chief. You really need to be delegating that to your subordinates. But yeah, it's mixed. I mean, I think his reputation has been exaggerated. His poor reputation was exaggerated. But I would suggest maybe this is a question probably for Ukrainian soldiers to speak, and probably off the record, because it's difficult to criticize the Commander-in-Chief when you're fighting a war, and obviously they would obviously believe that any kind of criticism would be exploited by the enemy, I would have thought.
Thank you. That's interesting. And on the podcast recently, we've been discussing very much a macro strategic look of the war. And what's fascinating about your perspective is that you're able to talk about that as well as seeing it up close and talking to people who are on the micro level of living it day to day. One thesis that's been debated, put forward at present, is this idea that perhaps the most severe threat that Ukraine faces in 2024 has now passed, now that the green light has been given in terms of weapons being able to be used on Russian soil, some of the weapons filtering through from America and other places that, of course, was starved from the Ukrainians for so long this year. I just wondered whether you had a tangible sense of that being true or being sensed at all amongst the Ukrainians that you speak to, or is it still so vivid, so real, so dangerous at the moment that there isn't that sense that things have turned a corner in terms of the very worst case scenarios this year? Just general reflections on that question would be very interesting.
I think it's always difficult to imagine the very worst case scenario, but I would definitely say that it's a lot easier fighting against a large opposing army when you have artillery shells as opposed to not having artillery shells. And that was the situation for many Ukrainian units before the supplemental assistance package passed in the United States. Literally, some Ukrainian units had no artillery ammunition at all. Some Ukrainian artillery crews were resorting to firing smoke shells at oncoming Russian forces because they have nothing else. So I think, again, it's always difficult to imagine what could be the worst possible scenario, but it's not as bad as it was before. They have significant amounts of artillery ammunition, GMLRS rounds for HIMARS, and pretty much everything else. So, yeah, I would say the critical danger point has passed, for sure.
Well, thank you very much, Francis and Dom, for your questions. Jimmy, just one more from me. At the beginning of this interview, you said that you had to leave your apartment because of the power cuts. Could you just give us a bit of a sense of what daily life is like now in Kyiv with these power cuts. What's the atmosphere like? How are people managing? What kind of strategies have they put in place personally and within friendship groups or families to deal with this and to get through it?
Yeah, so I mean, power outages are relatively simple to deal with. I mean, there's a schedule generally which is published by DTEC, one of the big utility companies here, which tells people when the power is going to be off or likely to be off, and you can plan your day around that. Most people have got power banks. A lot of people have got generators. A lot of businesses, in fact, most businesses now have got generators. So if you haven't got power at home, you can go to a local cafe, use their internet, charge your devices. So yeah, Kyiv is honestly perfectly livable. It's when you go out to the east, Kharkiv, some of the cities in Donbass, Kramatorsk, Luhansk, it gets really difficult because a lot of them have far more power outages and some of them don't have running water anymore, and there's obviously far more incoming Russian artillery and missile attacks. So honestly, I'd be lying if I said living in Kyiv at the moment was difficult, because it isn't.
Coming up, we hear Dom, Francis and Jimmy's final thoughts. Jimmy, thank you so much for joining us. We'll come back to you for your final thoughts in a few minutes, but can I go first to Dom Nicholls? Dom.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I'm going back to Putin in North Korea, and I see him cozying up to these kind of characters, and I just wonder what is the price there? So as he's having to now embrace these global pariahs, what's he expected to do? So we think he's going to be exchanging missile technology and all the rest of it with North Korea. But what else? He's getting close to Iran. So, for example, will we now hear Putin lobbying for, or at least protecting, Iran's nuclear ambitions? He's already made comments about the non-proliferation treaty. Is he going to go further? So what's he having to do for these regimes in order to get the drones and the shells and all the rest of it? And just summing it up, I couldn't sum up today's view any better than has been done so by Piotr Kurzin, geopolitical and policy professional, previously the UN, World Bank and Crisis Group. Piotr, thanks so much for chatting earlier on today. And he said this relationship, the Putin and Kim Jong-un relationship, is nothing more than one of convenience, one based purely on materialistic interests, not ideological and shared values. If Putin had any better options, he'd never resort to such nonsense with Pyongyang. If Putin did value the DPRK, North Korea, in the way he's pretending he does now, he would not have waited 20 plus years to establish such a partnership. It's nothing more than an embarrassment for a leader as powerful and impressive as Putin, or more claim to have plunged to new lows. And I think that sort of sums it up. Thank you, Piotr, for that. I mean, it really is. It's blatantly a marriage of convenience, and I think a sign of increasing desperation. So, yes, we note that it's not necessarily good for the world because it gives North Korea more than likely, more missile technology. But it does, in the context of this war, Russia's war in Ukraine, I think it does speak of increasing isolation, increasing desperation, and as we were saying the other day, just increasing paranoia from Putin, that he has to cozy up to some of the less salubrious characters around the neighbourhood.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls. Francis Dearnley, can I come to you next?
Thanks, David. I've talked many times about the demise of the Soviet system, the reasons for it and the lessons for today. Tony Jutt's Post-War remains absolutely essential reading on the subject. But an interesting thesis has been put forward by the distinguished historian Niall Ferguson in The Free Press. He wonders whether the West, and specifically America, might be the Soviets now, in the analogies of comparing why the Soviet system collapsed with the present-day context of Cold War II, as it's often articulated. So he identifies areas of similarity. Quote, a chronic soft budget constraint in the public sector, seen in the US deficits forecast by the Congressional Budget Office to exceed 5% of GDP for the foreseeable future. The insertion of the central government into the investment decision process. I see that too. The US economy might be the envy of the rest of the world today, but recall how American experts overrated the Soviet economy in the 1970s and 1980s, he writes. We have a military that is simultaneously expensive and unequal to the task it confronts. Too, like the Soviet Union. Even more striking to me are the political, social and cultural resemblances I detect within the US and the USSR. Geriatric leadership was one of the hallmarks of late Soviet leadership, personified by the senility of Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernyakov. Another Notable feature of late Soviet life was a total public cynicism about nearly all institutions, bogus ideologies that hardly anyone really believes in, but everyone has to parrot unless they want to be labelled dissidents. Check. A population that no longer regards patriotism, religion, having children or community involvement as important. Check. How about a massive disaster that lays bare the utter incompetence that pervades every level of government? For Chernobyl, read COVID. He concludes, the question that haunts me is, what if China has learned the lessons of Cold War I better than we have? I fear Xi has not only understood that, at all costs he must avoid the fate of his Soviet counterparts. I still cling to the hope that we can avoid losing Cold War II, that the economic, demographic and social pathologies that afflict all one-party communist regimes will ultimately doom Xi. But we should ponder the question. So that's Niall Ferguson there. I'm not sure I would draw the parallel quite as strong as that. There is a latent potential in democracies that is extinguished in totalitarian regimes. But it provides food for thought as to the current trends prevalent in the West and their impacts, particularly when considering historical parallels. We'll add a link in the description. Very interested in hearing listeners' thoughts on that question.
Well, we should get Niall Ferguson on, and I'm sure he could answer your points as well, Francis. Jimmy, can we come to you in Kyiv for our very final thoughts? Jimmy Rushton.
Yeah, sure. I'd just like to come back to what we talked about in regards to North Korea. I think you can see across the world there is an alliance, either official or semi-official, between these authoritarian states, Russia, the DPRK, Iran, China to a lesser extent. And I think we underestimate the significance of what's happening in Ukraine at our peril, because if Russia is allowed to win, if Russia is allowed to conquer Ukraine, exploit its natural resources, its manpower, it will then be on the border with multiple NATO states. And at that point, Russia will have a military which is probably too difficult, too dangerous to Putin to stand down. And yeah, I think we really need to reassess how important this is, because it's very easy to get lost in have elections in the UK, elections in the United States. It's very easy to take our eye off what's happening here and the significance of what's happening here to us all.
And Jimmy, very quickly, for those listeners who want to follow your work and follow what you do out in Ukraine, how can they do that?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter, or X as it's now called, as Jimmy Sec UK. I have a Substack. I've also written occasionally for the Telegraph. So yeah, in these places.
Well, thank you very much, Jimmy. We'll put all of those links in the show notes, so do go there to follow Jimmy's work in the future. Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls, Francis Dearnley and Jimmy Rushton for your time. Quick reminder that next Thursday we'll be at the Chalke Valley History Festival. We'll put a link in the show notes again to that. And next Saturday, the 29th, Armed Forces Day here in the United Kingdom, we'll be at Scarborough Fair doing a live recording there with our very own Roland Oliphant. Again, we'll put the link in the show notes to that. So do hope to see many of you there. Do let us know if you're coming. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.